My name is Tryp Gorman, and in this episode of Semilla.VC, I sit down with Antonio Gómez, co-founder of Mexico City-based medical and recreational marijuana startup Tryp. Antonio started as just the fourth member of Uber's operation team in Mexico City back in 2014 and spent almost 5 years at Uber in both Mexico City and San Francisco, rising up to be their head of marketplace operations for Latin America. He then moved to London to work for the Softbank Index Tiger Global-backed financial super app Revolut. After Revolut, he spent almost a year as chief operating officer of Mexico City-based Hola before co-founding Tryp to capitalize on the wave of medical and recreational marijuana in Latin America. In this episode, you will learn the current regulatory environment of medical and recreational marijuana in Latin America, how Antonio attracted early Uber drivers in Mexico City despite them being attacked by taxi drivers, what Antonio would say to a Latin American prior to assimilating to a work environment in San Francisco or the United States for the first time, and also about Tryp's fight for access to advertising platforms and financial services, and how their bank accounts were even temporarily frozen. Learn about all this and more in this episode of Semilla.VC. Antonio, could you start by telling the audience a bit more about your work history up to and including founding Tryp?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Tryp. First of all, I was born and raised in Mexico City. I attended a German school since I was a kid, so that very early on exposed me to different cultures, and I think that's a big part of what ended up making me who I am, and taking the decisions that I've been taking along my career path. And yeah, I think with that, the first time I left my home was when I was 14 years old. I actually went to live and study in Germany. After that, I went to study civil engineering at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And initially I went to university thinking I wanted to build skyscrapers and dams and bridges and whatnot, and then ended up finding out that I was more passionate about moving people around and things around, and specialized in transportation instead. Through that work, actually, right out of university, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I was kind of like with mixed feelings about my experience studying civil engineering, but then very quickly I found a good job in a consulting firm. It was a Spanish consulting firm in Mexico that was working precisely on developing a national infrastructure plan for the federal government in Mexico. And there, I had the opportunity to actually apply my knowledge in the transportation side of things, from very early on at a very important project for the country. And not to make the story too long, but I mostly sat in very technical meetings, and then very political meetings where I saw everything technical go to waste, because some of the decisions made didn't have anything to do with the technical side. But yeah, it was a very interesting experience, which actually led me to my next job, which I think is one of the most important steps in my career. I ended up joining Uber very early on when they were launching in Mexico. I was actually the fourth person in operations for the Mexico team. So very early on, we had to essentially do the basics, right? So convince drivers one by one, install the app in each of the phones, sit in endless meetings with people who didn't understand how the actual payments worked and so on. So it was an amazing experience to actually get to the ground, work on something from scratch. And then see it develop, right? So I was at Uber for about 4.5 years, where my role changed constantly, right? So I initially was doing operations in Mexico City, then I started doing projects more at the Mexico level, then at the Latin America level. I then ended up moving to San Francisco to join a product team building globally. So it was an amazing experience to see it develop that way, and also see kind of my role expand in many ways and my impact expand in many ways. After this 4.5 years, kind of decided it's time for me to move on and try my luck in another industry. I actually joined Revolut in London. At that time, Revolut was already big, but not as big as they are right now, and they were operating only in Europe. And only is not to say that it's a small thing, but I joined the team to help them expand in different markets outside of Europe. That included markets like Japan, Singapore, the US, Canada, and as well, I helped them establish the operations team. Right, so initially the team was a team of about 10 persons sitting mostly in London, all the work being super centralized. And then I helped the team expand to be 110 people sitting globally, and then obviously having a much more robust way of operating the businesses that were actually being launched in the different markets. So that was also an amazing experience. Ultimately saw that Latin America was one of the regions that Revolut wasn't targeting at the time, and I was super interested. Obviously, I'm Mexican, so there's a natural interest there. But I also see the opportunity that Latin America has, in many ways. And so I decided to actually join a small fintech that was looking to do something very similar to what Revolut was doing in Europe, but starting with Mexico, and then with the ambition of scaling to Latin America. So this platform was Hola Cash. At the time, we were building a B2C product, payments product, mostly centered in Mexico. And after almost 1 year working with them, I decided to jump to the opportunity that I'm working on right now. I saw that in terms of the legal drugs, cannabis is one that is coming up more frequently in different markets, right? So in the US, you have it already legal in many places, many states. You have many European countries already talking about legalization, and not only for medicinal use or only palliative use. It's also for recreational use, for adult use, if you want to talk about more expanded uses. And so was really curious about it. My co-founder and I have always been passionate about other recreational uses for cannabis, understanding the different effects that this plant can have in your day-to-day, from being a tool for physical wellness to being a tool for mental wellness. And so we decided to look deeper into it. We saw that the laws were already giving us a space to work with something in Mexico, and decided to start Tryp. Right, so Tryp is currently a marketplace platform whereby we connect sellers and buyers of legal cannabis products, starting with Mexico, but also wanting to expand to the rest of Latin America. And yeah, essentially that's what I'm currently working on.
So what's the current trend of legalization of recreational and medical marijuana in Latin America, country to country?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, first of all, we're seeing different countries are starting with the most obvious question is, starting with the medicinal use, right? So how can we use cannabis to actually treat chronic diseases, pain, insomnia, even just day-to-day anxiety. And so more and more countries, for example, in the past 6 months, I can recall Costa Rica, Colombia, Argentina, Mexico, they've been opening the market for the medicinal use of cannabis already, and some of them are already talking about recreational use as well, right? So Mexico is the one that is already, discussing this in the Senate. Colombia, for example, I think actually last week the new president in Colombia mentioned that they want to fully legalize cannabis for recreational use in Colombia without licenses, which is obviously a radical take, but it's obviously it tells you something about where the industry is going. And so we believe that the direction is clear, right? It's just a matter of how fast we're gonna get there, and we really want to be first on the game. That's why we started Tryp there.
Similar emerging startups in the industry in the United States many years ago, they had issues with bank accounts, things like that. What are some issues that you guys are facing doing the same sort of thing in Latin America?
Yeah, I know, and that's a great question. It's amazing because like there's a lot of misinformation out there, disinformation. We've had trouble as well, right? So first, you think about the most obvious things for companies to actually establish themselves. Like we don't even have access to some of those services, financial services, right? So getting a bank account was a problem for us, right? So and it's still a problem, right? We sometimes have to explain a lot of things to different banks, when it's just simple transactions for most of the businesses, right? But yeah, so financial services is a big one, right? So banks have a lot of trouble understanding our business, and also understanding the legal framework where we're currently standing. I'll be honest as well, right? It is actually complicated, and that's why it's currently being legislated and discussed in the Senate in Mexico, right? Because it is still not super certain, not super clear. There are some contradictions, and so we understand that we want to be collaborative, but it's also a pain right now. That's one of the issues. The second issue, and I think this is broader, and this also extends to markets outside of Latin America, is, for example, marketing, right? In advertising, most of the platforms, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, any big platforms that you can think of, they essentially don't allow any mentions of cannabis, right? So there's no way you can actually pay for an ad to go out talking about cannabis or showing a product that it's just cannabis, even if it's for medicinal use, right? There are some very small allowances that they do, but it's super arbitrary as well, right? Someday you might have it out, and then someday it's shut down. We've had different accounts in Instagram being shut down, ads taken down, assets freezed. So it's been a huge mess, but in some way it's a lot of fun, right? And it reminds us of the early days, as well as when we were operating in Uber, right? So similar to what we had at Uber at the very beginning, right? So it was a legal product or a legal service, but not a regulated service. And there was a lot of discussion around what could be done, what could be done. Obviously, all the history with taxi syndicates, drivers, and all of that. So we're having something similar, not at that scale yet, but yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Could you tell us more about your time at Uber in Mexico City, and maybe even one of those stories about the growing pains right at the beginning with airports or taxis, or some of those struggles right at the beginning?
Yeah, definitely. So, to give some context, when I was at Uber in Mexico City, I was responsible for everything on the supply side, right? So getting more drivers on the platform, making sure that they were driving as often as we wanted them to drive, that they were earning the right amount of money, so they really engaged with the platform, and obviously making them happy so they actually stayed for the long term. I think that last part was quite hard for us in Mexico at the very beginning, right? So the earnings were there. I think that was not an issue. The demand was there, right? So obviously Uber was growing at a crazy rate at that point, and one of the biggest constraints on our end was the supply. But then I think those experiences with violence and safety in Mexico were crazy. That even one incident, one single isolated incident could scare off hundreds of drivers, and they wouldn't come on to drive on the platform during the most demanded times, right? So for example, Saturdays at night, Fridays at night, right? Because they knew that obviously taxis also are chasing for people who are looking for transportation at that point, or at that time of the week. And so a lot of conflicts happened on the street. I would say we didn't really have anything that was concerning on a large scale, but it was more a matter of kind of handling the perceptions that isolated events created amongst the drivers. you could see, rumors started to spread very quickly, and it was sometimes funny, how to see how these things spread, just in different WhatsApp groups, Instagram groups, Facebook groups, and someone says something, in the streets, and then everyone is talking about it, even though it's not true. So yeah, I couldn't tell you about one specific event, but definitely, we had many events that were concerning more from a perspective of fear from drivers than from an actual, we really thought that it was an issue for the driver safety.
How would you compare your time at Uber in Mexico City and your time at Uber in San Francisco, both with the workplace, the culture, the ideals? Tell us a little bit more about that juxtaposition.
Yeah, I think it was, when I was in Mexico City, I felt that, we were mainly operating, hustling, and, just, day to day finding ways to grow, finding ways to survive, right? In many ways, it was just, that pure hustle that you can feel, and you can feel the electricity of it when you're inside of it. I moved to San Francisco, and obviously the pace is very different. The way of working is very different. The things that you start to think about are very different as well as the timelines, right? And so it was the first experience that I had, kind of like switching to a tech world, but actually from inside the tech team and the product teams, right? I was, in Mexico City, I was in a tech company, but mostly on the operational side, and very on the ground. And when I moved to San Francisco, it was very different in many ways. I believe the first thing was actually thinking more strategically, was something that I learned over there, right? So when you're on the ground, you just think about the tactics that you need to grow, your numbers day to day, month to month, and just keep it going. And when I moved to San Francisco, now you really have to thought about, for example, issues like safety, right? So what happens if you have these issues that we were seeing, for example, in Mexico, but in a more repetitive fashion? What happens if you have them more often in the streets? What happens if you actually have serious safety issues? And we started to see those patterns as well, right? So we started to see some cities are more dangerous than others. For example, in Latin America, cities in Brazil, there are some cities, some regions within cities in Brazil that are super dangerous, right? And we saw what we saw in Mexico City, but on a larger scale. And now we had to think about those things, right? So how do we actually solve for those things systematically, and not just from a purely tactical way like we were doing in Mexico City, right? And so, so in many ways, I had to really work with a lot of stakeholders from, a central place that was not ideal to understand, sometimes the Latin American context, right? So you're sitting in San Francisco and trying to understand what happens to a person who gets on a car in the middle of a favela in Rio. So, it's obviously, very, very difficult to kind of understand that from the distance, but also to communicate with the people who are actually building the solutions for this, serious problem. So it was a very different type of job for me, and I remember having a lot of philosophical and ethical questions and discussions with GMs across different markets in Latin America, but also with product managers sitting in San Francisco. And it was definitely a much more challenging in time for me, professionally speaking. I think that's where we really had to think deep, understand the questions, understand the different answers, because, for example, something like safety, and I've been talking about safety right now, but something like safety, the standards are not the same across different cultures, right? So you could have a culture that is very, very bullish and saying, police needs to take care of everything that has to do with safety and crime in the streets, and so Uber has nothing to do with it. So we shouldn't change our platform to kind of like help in any way that issue, or that issue to improve. But then you have other cultures where you have people saying, it's actually your responsibility to make sure that the riders who actually request a ride are vetted before taking a ride, right? That is something that doesn't make sense for a person in San Francisco to do, but probably if you're in a favela in Rio, you want to know who's getting on your car when you're a driver, driving an Uber, right? So a lot of those questions started to come up. So it was a very interesting time. I think much more enriching from a perspective of a strategic thinking. And yeah, I think one of the biggest decisions in my life to move to this role, and a clear before and after for me as well, right? I think my thinking changed radically after that.
What would you tell the Antonio today who's lived in Mexico City, had some time in Germany like you maybe, but is deciding to work in the United States for a little bit? What would you tell them about assimilating to kind of the work culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I think the most important thing was realizing that problems aren't perceived the same way from a distance, right? And I think that was one of the things that it makes sense when you talk about it, but it's not as simple to understand when you're sitting in your desk in San Francisco and trying to see numbers and patterns just from a purely technical perspective than when you go to a place, actually experience what's happening there, and you're like, oh, actually, this is very different from what I was seeing in the data. So initially, I kind of like thought that people would kind of get a lot of these things up front without us having to kind of like do a lot of hands-on work or visiting places. And initially, we I don't think I did a good job at communicating some of the needs that we needed in Latin America, for example, because I thought that people kind of like were more sensible to these things. And so it took me a lot of sensibilizing a lot of people to these issues, but also getting people to experience that themselves. Right? It was only when we traveled with the tech teams sitting in San Francisco to Latin America, and then we sat in a favela, ordered an Uber, and then you actually see, wow, this is actually a very weird experience the way we have it, right? And so maybe it makes sense to change things in some way. And it's obviously not a simple thing to do. It's obviously not a simple thing to explain, nor is it a simple thing to solve. But it's I think that's the most important thing that I would say to myself before going to the US. Right? So it's not that simple to understand before you actually experience it yourself.
So could you tell the audience a little bit more about your time at Revolut and Hola and why those experiences made you want to found Tryp?
Yeah, definitely. So my time at Revolut, actually Revolut, it was an interesting story because I was actually traveling. I was in Japan, and I was spending money with my debit card from Mexico, and so I was just seeing every time I swipe my card, I have commissions, and obviously also exchange rates that were super bad, right? So obviously not favorable for anyone who does that. So I was like, there has to be a better way. It doesn't make sense that I am paying more of my money just to use it, right? And so I just started Googling, how to actually get better rates using debit and credit cards. And so I came across Revolut, and I saw that they were launching in different markets. Right, I actually applied to Revolut wanting to expand to Latin America. Right, so I was like, this has to come to Latin America. This, is needed in Latin America, for many reasons. Right, so you have obviously, the travel, the people traveling, and it was a big use case for Revolut. That was a big part of it. But also, when you think about remittances, right, from the U.S. and Mexico, it's one of the largest remittances corridors in the world, right? So I think the three biggest are the U.S. with India, China, and Mexico, right? And so that's a huge use case, right? So and I thought this is something that will do a lot of good to people in the region, right? I ended up joining in Revolut, and initially, the first thing they told me is, go ahead and open Brazil for Revolut. And obviously I started working on it, but it wasn't as easy, right? So it's not as simple to do that. Obviously, Brazil especially is a difficult market for many of these things. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but it's a difficult thing to do. And so decided to well, actually I didn't decide, but the company decided to spend more time actually expanding in other places, right? So as I mentioned, the Canadian business, the US, Japan, Singapore, Australia, some other more obvious markets, right? And so I think after 1.5 years working there, it was an amazing experience, but I kind of became impatient, right? So the original intention for me to join Revolut was to actually bring it to Latin America. And so at that time, I was approached by some ex-Uber folks that were actually are currently still building Hola, and it made a lot of sense for me to join them and actually start something in Mexico directly. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the biggest factor that actually influenced my decisions in that point. And I think how that influenced me starting Tryp and kind of diving into the cannabis industry. I think it's not that related, right? In many ways, it's very far from Revolut and All Cash. But I think it's actually it made me realize that I really enjoyed the hustle of the operations days at Uber, right? Being in Revolut and All Cash made me realize, but maybe this is not the best thing that I could do with, one, my skills, and second, the way I think about things, and which is a bit more chaotic in many ways, not as highly regulated as finance, even though cannabis is regulated. So yeah, I think I really was looking to come back to the days of hustling, living day to day, moving things around physically, and building technology around that physical movement.
How has the Latin American venture capital and technology ecosystem changed since you joined Uber in 2014?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think when I joined Uber, you didn't really hear much about VCs in Latin America, right? So obviously you heard about the stories of Uber, Airbnb, those companies that were starting to, be the unicorns at the time, and receiving a ton of investment. But it was not something that you heard in your day-to-day in Latin America, right? So when I talk to people about stock options and VCs and investments and seed rounds and so on, most of the people didn't know about what I was talking about, and I myself didn't know anything about it before joining Uber, right? So it tells you something about the maturity of that in Latin America. In now it's the other way around, and it's a radically different version of Latin America when I think about it, right? So you see most of the people now, everyone wants to work at startups. Everyone knows what stock options are. Everyone talks in terms of races, fundraises, who's raised what, and I think it's a very exciting time for Latin America in that way. And I'm happy to be part of it in a very small way, but also happy to see how fast people are developing right now. I see people coming out of university, having huge careers in startups. That it's just amazing. We didn't have that before. Before leaving to study in Germany and in Canada, one of the promises I made myself was I want to come back to Latin America. I want to give back to the region, and I really believed at that time that in 10, 15 years time, Latin America was going to be kind of the region to be in, right? So economically speaking, from a development perspective as well. So I believe that we're seeing that right now, and I'm super excited about it.
Okay, finally, I have to ask Peter Thiel's famous contrarian question, but with a uniquely Semilla.VC twist. What important truth about Latin America do very few people agree with you on?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think when I think of Latin America, right, and this is possibly going to sound cliche, but you hear Latin America and you immediately think of passion, party, some chaos. And I think we really, as humans, I think we really thrive in an environment where we do have some chaos, but some order and organization as well, right? So I think Latin America is currently in that phase of its history that it's just getting enough order and organization to develop very quickly and to be important economically, but at the same time it still has a lot of the chaos that makes it interesting, that makes it even productive in a creative way, right? So it's not the same kind of just being always in an industry that's super regulated, in a country that's where everything works perfectly, than to having to go out to the street and finding your way out because you don't know how everything works in a new city in Latin America, right? So I think, to me, and this reminds me of something that Travis at Uber said a lot. We need to be operating at the right balance of order and chaos. And too much order is bad. Too much chaos is also bad. And finding that middle ground is where the sweet spot is. And I think we are currently in that sweet spot in Latin America. And I hope that we kind of get order in the places where we really need to get order, and that we remain chaotic in the places where we can't afford to be chaotic. So I think that's the way to think about Latin America.
What an excellent answer. Antonio, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Semilla.VC podcast today.
Thank you, Tryp. Thank you very much for the time. And great.
Thank you for watching this episode of Semilla.VC. Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you watch your podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at Gorman Tryp, and subscribe to Semilla.VC's Dealflow LA newsletter, which can be found at dealflow.la.